Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Let's get started. I think it's time to get started. Welcome to the third session in the Luxembourg Sustainable Finance Seminar Series, organized by the University of Luxembourg and the LSFI. My name is Michael Halling, and I'm a professor of finance at the University of Luxembourg. And it is my great pleasure to moderate today's event on the question, do we need a social taxonomy? Currently, the public debate is dominated by environmental concerns and regulation targeting climate change as well as green investments. However, the broader theme of sustainable finance also includes the S, or the social dimension, and the G, or governance. Today's event will focus on the social dimensions. Examples of topics that fall into this group of issues include employee relations, human rights, diversity, and caring for the community, among other aspects. Just to remind you, the plan of today's event is to kick it off with 3 10-minute presentations by our industry experts. Then we will have a 30-minute panel discussion followed by a Q&A session. Thus, please post any questions that you might have during the event in the chat, and we will try to bring it up in the end. Given this tight schedule, I suggest that we get started right away. Our first speaker will be Antje Schneeweiß, who is a member of the European Union Sustainable Finance Platform, a member of the Sustainable Finance Committee of the Federal Government of Germany, and the General Secretary of the Working Group of Church Investors. She has been working on sustainable investments in Germany for 30 years and will provide us with an introduction into the European social taxonomy. Antje, the floor is yours.
Thank you for inviting me to this session, and I'm pleased to show you the first results of the working group on social taxonomy within the European Platform on Sustainable Finance. I will show some slides and guide you through these ideas. So, can you see this?
Yes.
So,
yes, we can.
Now I think it's better. Okay. So just a very, very short introduction to what the Sustainable Finance Platform is. It's actually part or enshrined in the taxonomy regulation. So it's an expert group which is enshrined in law. Today, there are 4 working subgroups. The technical working group working on ecology, working on environmental criteria, on the environmental criteria for other than climate environmental objectives. Subgroup 3 is working on a taxonomy for harmful and low impact activities. Subgroup 4 is working on the social taxonomy, and subgroup 5 is working on data availability and usability. And of course, all these subgroups are working together, and the social taxonomy subgroup is especially working quite closely together with data and usability, as well, we will see later on. These are very important points of discussion for a social taxonomy. So your title today is, do we need a social taxonomy? And this is actually the first question we asked ourselves. And we actually found 5 points why we do need a social taxonomy. First of all, there is a need for social investment, for more social investment, for example, in affordable housing, healthcare, training, but also in respect for human rights, workers' rights, and consumer rights and communities. Then there is a direct link to the environment because the environmental transformation of our economies will have social impacts. And that is why we need a just transition to make these impacts socially just. Then investors have been looking for and more finding social investment opportunities. This has been most apparent with the pandemic-driven social bonds, which the EU has been offering a couple of months ago. But there are also social risks. So if companies do not consider social perspectives and topics, they actually run a risk. And this is even more so as more and more countries in Europe actually introduce due diligence laws, with fines and punishments. So here, social actually is becoming material, just as climate has become material before. And of course, finally, we might even have an European, or we will have a European due diligence law, which makes this viable for all European companies. Just as with the environmental taxonomy, we have a lack of definitions and standardized classifications. What does social mean? And this is even more pronounced probably in the social sphere than in the environmental sphere. I mean, when you look at ESG ratings, different ESG ratings, you see that the differences on social topics are the results actually on social topics that deviate much larger when it comes to social than when it comes to environmental issues. So first of all, one important question was, where are the differences between environmental and social? We find it more hard to actually found our recommendations on science, yes, as the environmental taxonomy does. And we said the foundation for social taxonomy will be internationally agreed norms and principles, like the UN guiding principles, but also the European social pillar, OECD guidelines, and so on. Then we find it very difficult to address the actually indicators and criteria to activity. The environmental taxonomy is actually a taxonomy of economic activities, whereas many social issues are actually linked to the entity, the economic entity. That is, we try to find a solution for this. One solution is that we actually also take up special products, socially relevant products and services. And the third difference we found is that while economic activities tend to have a negative impact on the environment, nearly always, or with some few exceptions, economic activities tend to have a positive social impact, an inherent positive social impact, because they create jobs, social protection contributions, and so on, training. So with the social taxonomy, it's difficult to, it's very important to make a distinction between inherent social benefits and additional benefits when actually criteria are worked out. Our first idea, or the first structure we found, is that there are two ways to be socially beneficial. The one is to have processes in place which ensure decent work, promote consumer interest, and enable inclusive and sustainable societies. So that is a process part, which we call horizontal dimension. And then we have a vertical dimension, which is focused on products and services with inherent social benefits, and because they serve basic human needs. And then there is a basic human infrastructure, which also can have a social benefits. So these are the vertical objectives of the social taxonomy, as we suggested so far. So I actually deleted quite a lot. With the vertical dimension, we say that this is actually also based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because there are actually economic, social, and cultural rights enshrined in this document. And it says that everybody has the right to a standard of living, adequate health and well-being for himself and his family. So this is actually also part of the human rights. The SDG incorporates these rights as well: no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, and quality education. So you find it here as well. And of course, the vertical dimension is also very important for social cohesion and economic growth and economic stability. Yeah, that is, and the more detailed criteria would be water, food, housing, healthcare, education, on the part of the basic human rights, and on the part of the economic infrastructure, it would be transport, telecommunication, and internet, clean electricity, financial inclusion, and waste management. This is not complete. These are our first suggestions. For the vertical dimension, actually, for the horizontal dimension, we couldn't actually work out criteria or approaches to criteria so far. But for the vertical dimension, we suggest that the AAAQ concept is actually applied to work out criteria. So that would be the foundation for the criteria. And we could think that it might work like this, that actually improving availability where necessary and accessibility, including economically accessibility, actually would be a substantial contribution to these objectives, whereas acceptability and quality would be the do no significant harm part. So to give an example, if a company actually develops a new pharmaceutical and does a lot to make it economically accessible, then the quality must be adequate as well. So it can't be, because it's cheaper, it shouldn't be, it should have still have the same internationally accepted quality. And here we have one example of what the criterion could look like. We've worked together with the Access to Medicine Foundation here. So a set of criteria for substantial contribution could be that the drug is affordable and economically sustainable for countries where it is distributed. There is an access strategy for the new medicine, which is developed when it's clinically tested. There is a monitoring of the percentage of the patients group which needs the medicine, and of course, it has to be registered in many countries, in all countries actually, which need the medicine, and not only there where it is most where the company will be able to sell the most. So that would be a substantial contribution, and do no significant harm would, of course, be also the process-related criterion like workers' rights, communities, and consumers' rights. And of course, it has to meet the internationally accepted standards of quality. We did some work on governance and worked out 3 topics of sustainable governance, which we would highlight in the social taxonomy. That would be non-aggressive tax planning, and transparent and non-aggressive tax planning, anti-bribery and anti-corruption, and responsible lobbying and political engagement. We did some thinking about socially harmful activities. We said that for a first step, we have to work out the source, the rationale why we think, or we could say that certain activities are socially harmful. And here we said that if these activities actually violate internationally agreed conventions, for example, on certain kinds of weapons, that would be always socially harmful. Or if these activities have a detrimental effects on health and safety. From the environmental taxonomy, we know that only one activity is actually considered to be harmful, and that is power generation by coal. So the bar to say that a certain activity is always harmful is quite high. And of course, there will be a lot of discussions about this. So now one of your questions was, how do the environmental and the social taxonomy actually relate to each other? We have worked out 2 models. In one model, which you see here, the social and environmental taxonomy are quite distinct from each other. So we have substantial contribution criteria for the environment and different environmental do no significant harm criteria, and then minimum safeguards on social and governance. And we have a social taxonomy with substantial contribution criteria for social do no significant harm criteria, and minimum safeguards on environment and governance. Then we could merge these closer together. And here we still have different substantial contribution for environment and social, but the do no significant harm criteria would be the same for both taxonomies. And we still would need minimum safeguards on governance issues, and also probably on some social issues, which can't be framed as do no significant harm criteria. Yeah, that's it. The final report will be published in February. And then after this, the Commission will decide whether there should be a social taxonomy or not.
Great. Thanks a lot, Antje. Before we're going to move on to our second speaker, I would like to correct very quickly a mistake that I made in the introduction of this event, which is not only organized by the University of Luxembourg and LSFI, but also by SPTF, the Social Performance Task Force, who played a very important role in putting together the program. So thank you very much. My apologies. So let's move on to with our second speaker, who will be Tim Crijns, who's the lead fund manager for Triodos Microfinance Fund and for Triodos Fair Share Fund, which in total manage around 800 million euros. Tim has extensive experience with managing impact investments, in particular with the focus on Africa. Tim, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you for having me here. What I will do first is explain a little bit where we're coming from. So what do we do with Triodos Bank, but also what do we do in financial inclusion, which is the sector where we gained experience in, and also in the wider SPTF context, as you just explained. Before, indeed, formulating some opinions, feedback on the social taxonomy. And what we see there. Starting with Triodos itself. So Triodos Bank is started in 1980 in the Netherlands as a bank with the idea that money could work for positive social and environmental and also cultural change. And I think this philosophy is really ingrained in everything we do at the bank. By now, Triodos Bank has assets under management of more than 20 billion, more than 700 customers in all 5 European countries. And also through some investment funds that we have, we are globally active. I think by nature, a lot of what we try to achieve now by for example, a sustainable finance disclosure regulation, but also social taxonomy is part of the raison d'etre that we have at Triodos Bank already for quite some time. Oh, sorry. This is Triodos Investment Management. This is the arm where I work from Triodos. This is where the investment funds are, and we invest globally, mainly in 3 themes. One is financial inclusion, microfinance. That's where I work. We're also active in energy transition. So that can be in Europe, closer to home, but also in emerging markets, for example. And the last one is sustainable food and agriculture. And we basically have also a holistic view on these. So these are not just 3 separate themes, but we think these are working together in a way actually to improve our lives and the people and the nature around us. If we then look specifically at financial inclusion, let me briefly explain what we do and what a lot of microfinance investors do these days. So I think microfinance is known as microcredits, so small loans to many people in emerging markets. It's not only about the credit. Equally important is, for example, the access to savings. Especially in COVID times, there was a survey among microfinance clients, and it showed that almost around 50% of the end clients had used their savings to actually weather this COVID storm, well, let alone they had savings accounts at all. So it's about all financial services from payments, loans, savings, but also, for example, financial training. A lot of people are financially illiterate and need to be trained before they actually can be granted a loan. Well, we don't do that. There are microfinance institutions that do that. They have the local cultural knowledge and also the banking license in many cases to do this. And what we do at Triodos, we invest in microfinance institutions, smaller SME banks that provide small loans, and these days also fintechs. Just to make that clear where we come from. I will now stop sharing and move back to myself. What I think what we experienced in the financial inclusion sector, and financial inclusion microfinance started in the 70s, 80s, much from a development perspective. And in the 90s, it turned into much more commercial activity where commercial investors stepped in and started to provide microfinance to do good. So to do that in a responsible way. I think I've lived in and worked in Africa for some time myself. And it does justice to a lot of people to actually treat them as and to grant a loan on business terms. So in a lot of development activities, you see, well, it's a sort of talking about horizontal, vertical relationship. You're a victim. Here's my donation. And what you see with microfinance client, you're actually saying, I trust your business plan. I trust that you can repay this loan in 6 or 12 months. And this is basically how microfinance turned, well, in the 80s, 90s from development work to much more commercial activity. But very important in a responsible way, because we work with people that are financially illiterate. So every player in this sector also started to develop, well, their own criteria there, like what is in the best interest of the consumer. So starting up their own consumer protection principles, their own obligations to microfinance institution, how they should behave. At some point, there were many different certifications as well. And what the SPTF has mentioned, so the Social Performance Task Force, also did is bring all the microfinance investors together and to come up with one set of standards. Well, those are the universal standards for social performance management that we use in the sector. Covers quite a number of topics there, and that actually help us to have a standard all together. And that immediately, if you come to a microfinance institution and they say, okay, we work in this way according to the universal standards, well, that's we know what we talk about. Talking about the universal standards, it's not only criteria like you should have this or this or this, but it's much more helping microfinance institutions to realize their social objectives. So also for them to formulate clear social objectives, how to achieve them, develop a model there, and how to report on those to investors like us. And that's important to bring that whole framework and not so much like report on this and realize the target there. So this incorporated many standards. For people who are familiar with that, smart campaign series, it all comes together in the universal standards. What is most important is the end is that that you want the microfinance institution, the people working in the field, that they not only do a tick the box exercise, but actually have the ingrained in their entire policy that they do good in a commercial way. And I think that's what we want to realize. And I think that's also the wider belief that we have, that you can do business and do good at the same time. And you can have a reasonable profit, not excessive, but reasonable profit. And at the same time supporting people and be socially responsive. And I think that's also moving to a social taxonomy, what we want in the sector. It should not become like a tick the box exercise. What we want actually businesses to take on the responsibility. And we're not saying you cannot have a profit. You cannot make profit with a good business model. No, you should be able to have that profit. But also in line with social standards that we all actually have, universal standards, if you may call them. What maybe is a little bit of difference to the universal standards that we have, and what is needed if we look much more to social taxonomy, is that the universal standards are very voluntary in a way. So there's not much hard enforcement. It is basically on the belief that the microfinance investors, that they will push their investees, so the microfinance institutions, to adhere to these standards, etc. That might be different if you talk to companies that are not set up historically for social good. then maybe you need a different way of enforcement. So it's not a one-to-one comparison here, but that could be slightly different. In general, moving to the social taxonomy, also from a Triodos perspective, we are positive to the social taxonomy. In a way, it's good to formulate standards to have a common understanding what we mean by social business, if you may call it. Secondly, it helps to avoid social greenwashing or social washing. I don't think there's a social term equivalent to greenwashing yet, but this is something to avoid. It might be that quite some companies will pop up that say that they're there for social good, but yeah, are they really? And I think the devil is in the detail for social taxonomy. And this is the same what we see now with the environmental taxonomy as well. The discussion, like, is it too wide or not? Like, what kind of activities are included there? And if it will really work, if the social taxonomy really will do what the ambition is, and actually move companies to a different way of working. And that really depends on the details. If it's too wide, then it will lead to social greenwashing. If it's too specific, then there are much more other issues at hand, and that's much more, for example, on the lack of data. Is it at all possible to get actually the figures that are required? Well, I think we come to that later. Also, if you make it too narrow and just to one number, that's also a danger. If you only put job creation there, I think every company could come up with a number in job creation, etc. The same as we see now with environment. If you narrow it down to CO2 emissions, avoided CO2 emissions, that's also too narrow. So you need to find the right balance there, and that's actually quite a challenging task at the moment now for to develop a good working social taxonomy. What I think is good is the vertical and horizontal dimensions, as also explained by Antje. I think it's important to focus on products, but also on processes. I think what there's a tendency in the explanation is a little bit to make that equal to positive and negative screening. I would actually say that for both on the product side and for the process side, on both sides, you need positive and negative screening. And let me explain the negative and positive screening. So what we do at Triodos Investment Management, we look most of the times first, because that's what inspires us, the positive impact of a company. What do they actually want to realize? What they do want to do. So for example, in microfinance institutions, do they have additional products? And that's loans for education, to send kids to school, specific trainings, programs for more vulnerable people or women. Well, those are all positive aspects. At the same time, we look at negative aspects, and that's, for example, are they invested in certain sectors, polluting sectors that we don't want to be affiliated with, or, well, of course, child labor, let alone those negative screening criteria. But here also, actually, we do look, thinking about it, at products. So the actual loan product, is there, for example, well, a loan for education, but also a process. Does an MFI actually look at the repayment capacity of a person? Is the person able to repay that loan? And I think that's important to make explicit there. I'm already diving into a little bit into detail. Also, lots of questions that I still have around some other elements of the social taxonomy. For example, the AAAQ was presented. How will that work out in practice? The two models that are being presented. But let me stop here for now and give the floor back.
Thanks, Tim. Excellent. I think we'll have some time later on to maybe go into some of these details more thoroughly and also reflect on some of these topics. But before we do this, last but not least, let's come to our final speaker, who will be Delphine Rioux. Delphine is the Inclusive Growth Lead at BNP Paribas Asset Management and has driven the development of the inclusive growth model there. She has acquired extensive experience in the topic of ESG while working as an ESG analyst for several years in the different institutions. Delphine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm very happy to be with you. this afternoon. So I am going to rely on Maria or maybe Claire to share the PowerPoint and the slide. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. So here, so just briefly to introduce BNP Paribas Asset Management. So we are the subsidiary of the group BNP Paribas in asset management. So we manage diverse type of assets, equity, fixed income, private debt, and also what we call multi-asset. So it's a fund of funds. This is around, we have something like around 560 billions of euro under asset management. So I'm part of, so we are 3,000 people across the globe. And I am working in one department, which is called the Sustainability Center. And the mission of the Sustainability Center, we are 30 people, and we are here to support the integration of the ESG criteria in investment processes across all the asset class that I just mentioned. So I work in what we call the research department, and so my task is to lead the research on the ESG criteria, and I am focused on two sectors. One is auto sector, and the other one is industrial sector. It's a very the industrial sector. It goes from B2C company to transportation, to airport, to ships, so it's a very large and vast industry category. I mentioned this because I'm going to illustrate what I do from day to day and what means integration of social criteria and ESG criteria in investment processes. So, and I am the leader on the thematic inclusive growth. So why do we, so what do we mean by inclusive growth? I just want to this is what we call the 3 E's. The 3 E's, this is the backbone of our global sustainability strategy. So the global sustainability strategy has been enacted or published, I think in 2019, yeah. So almost more than 2 years ago. And the 3 E's that are on the screen, this is they express our forward-looking view in order to preserve two things, which are, of course, the matrix or the two sides of the coins for an asset manager. It's to combine sustainability with long-term market performance. And so how do we articulate this? Is that first, the energy transition is to support the shifting to low carbon economy. The second one is environmental sustainability, so to protect the biodiversity and our natural capital. And the third one is equality and inclusive growth. And so equality and inclusive growth, just a very, I would say, very short and straightforward definition, is an economic growth that is distributed fairly across society and create opportunities for all. So behind there are two arguments there. The first is a mention of the distribution of the revenue, okay? And the second part is a mention of creating the opportunity for all. So this part is really naming or shaming discrimination, okay? So we are looking at these two sides of the coin for inclusive growth. The first one is about inequality, I would say, of income. And the second will be inequality of opportunities. So I'm going to develop this a little bit further in the next slide. So I am, these 3 E's, they are, how do you say, they are trickle down through all the activity of our department. So as I said, I'm doing some research. I'm doing research on different type of sector, and I'm also leading the research on the inclusive growth thematic. And what we owe from the day to day, it is what we do is that we enrich and we create our proprietary ESG data model. And it means that we cover, or our portfolio manager, they cover something like, I mean, our investment universe, it's around 10,000 company, okay, around the globe. And so we deliver, or we perform an ESG scoring for each of these 10,000 company. So we rely on data provider. And sometimes we supplement the data provider because usually the data provider, they express the past behavior or the past performance of the company. And so we supplement by giving a forward-looking view. And this is why we are, I would say, we do this matrix with the sector and these 3 E's. We look for each company of each sector. How do they behave on the energy transition? How do they behave on the protection of environment? And how they behave on the equality and inclusive growth? And this is so this is what we call a sector review. And all this is made to enrich our ESG data model. And the ESG data model gives score, and the score, I mean, the portfolio manager in our company, they have to monitor the portfolio, which means that they have to monitor the constituent of the portfolio given the ESG score, okay? And they have to monitor it against the benchmark. So, so of course, it places us, I would say, at the center of to help the PM to integrate the ESG criteria in their process. So move on to the second. Yeah, sorry. Could you move to the third slide? Yeah, thank you very much. So how do we integrate the social dimension? I'm just going to illustrate this through our thematic. So I'm sorry because it's yeah. I hope you can see it, but. What I'm going to talk about is I'm going to take 2 examples of thematic funds that are focused on social dimension, and which is to say in our language, in our BNP Paribas language, to say it's related to the equality and inclusive growth thematic. So Maria, could you go to the second slide? Thank you very much. So here, this is the framework that we use on equity asset class. So we have been developing, and we have launched a fund which is called Inclusive Growth Fund. So it's what we call an equity strategy. It's an active equity strategy. So it means that a portfolio manager is actively managing the portfolio. So this one is to the goal of the fund is to identify the company that help to reduce inequalities, that help to reduce social inequalities through their practices mainly. So when I say practices, it's the same that processes or on the horizontal dimension that Antje was talking about. So here you have 5 pillars. Okay, the first one is I would say net safety for the most fragile. This is for decent work. What we aim is to identify company with good social protection, decent pay, and also health and safety schemes as well. What because we were talking about data and with a practical example, what we do here, for instance, is that we will look at what will be the percentage of temporary workers in the company. Okay, we will look at if there is any profit sharing scheme. And of course, we will look on I would say on a broader perspective. We will look about the collective bargaining agreement. We will look at also how the company is applying these guidelines to his workers and to the workers, but also across the supply chain. Okay, the second pillar is investing in social mobility. So social mobility is really linked to what I call inequality of opportunity. Here, the goal is to make the company as diverse as possible, and here the idea is to enable the social mobility. And we think that the corporate, of course, there is some action for government to invest massively in education program, but we think that corporate, they also have a role to play, and they can do that by nurturing and promoting the diversity. The other second part, which is very important for us, is the training and the development of skills. I will come back to that later, because for me, it's really the link with the social taxonomy that the EU is developing. But I will come back to that later. The third one is giving access to primary goods. I would say that this is referring to what the social taxonomy draft is naming as vertical dimension. So it's really about how the corporate, they find innovating solution to tackle social problems and to enable low-income people, underserved people, to get access to primary goods such as health, education, but also housing, mobility services. The fourth one is about business ethics. So the idea here is to ensure that the company is taking long-term interest in society interest in its strategy, and also how they ensure fair competition and how they comply with tax practices. And the fifth one is, which is not intuitive, is related to decarbonization of economy and protection of environment. This is related to our first two E's, energy transition and environmental protection, because we think that climate change is going to hit first the most vulnerable and to then increase the inequalities. And the second concept behind is also about the just transition. The idea is to be sure that when we are going to shift to low carbon economies, that it's going to disrupt business model, and it's going, of course, to create some winners and some losers. And we want to make sure that the loser will be well equipped to be able to catch up with the winners. So this is the framework on equity. And to make the link with the social taxonomy draft, this strategy that we built on equity asset class, it's really about horizontal dimension. It's really our belief that the corporate, they have a role to play to tackle social inequalities. And it's mainly through their practices and their processes. And I will make the link here with the data. And one really positive point from my perspective with the social taxonomy draft is that it's going to force or to make the company much more willingness or willing to report on social I would say KPI. For instance, I was mentioning the percentage of temporary worker. It's very hard to find this. The percentage of turnover as well. The gap between the gender gap, the gender pay gap is very, also it's very fine to find any figures about that. So this is one of the virtue of the social taxonomy draft. It's going to force company to report on some really core KPI. My second, so I'm going to stay on this
we're a little bit running out of time, if that's okay.
Sorry.
So
sorry,
maybe
I was just
1 minute.
Yeah, of course. My other point was about our strategy in the fixed income. So we have just launched, I'm just saying that I'm not here to do the promotion, but it's just like we have just launched our new fund, which is called Social Bond Fund, and it's going to invest in bonds aimed at financing projects with positive social impacts. And in this fund, we will have something like 70% which will be invested in a bond labeled social or sustainable. So it's promoting access to essential services such as water, health, affordable housing, employment, food, security. And so here, this is related to vertical dimension. And the other pocket of the fund will be invested in socially responsible companies. So it's really about practices of the company. And this is referring to the framework that I just presented on the 5 pillars. So very quickly, as a overall conclusion, the main virtue of the social, we are very positive, of course, on the social taxonomy. The first virtue is about to force, I mean, to encourage companies to report on some social KPI. The second one is about, I think, if we take a broader perspective, is around how to articulate the, I mean, it is really around the just transition concept. Because if you take a social taxonomy in a broader context, the idea it's the EU action plan, and there were 3 objectives: reach zero net greenhouse gas emission by 2050, decouple economic growth from resource use, and leave no person and no place behind. And so all this is. We see that the common denominator to achieve these 3 objectives is about identifying the skills that will be needed to achieve this low carbon transition. And to do that, we are going to need the information for the company about what will be the critical skills. And this is why I think this is the second virtue of the social taxonomy, is to encourage company to identify the skills that will be needed to achieve this energy transition phase. That's it from my side. Thank you for the extra time.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, I have a problem with my battery, so.
Okay, no worries. Well, thank you very much, Delphine. Thank you very much, Tim and Antje, for these excellent presentations and also sticking to the time, relatively speaking. Actually, I would like to start out to kick off the panel by giving the word back to Antje, because we started talking obviously about the social taxonomy, and now she heard quite some thoughts from 2, in some sort, like, future users of such a taxonomy, and also, of course, contributors to it. So, Antje, what kind of are your reflections on the input that you heard from Tim and Delphine about their views on the taxonomy?
Well, thank you, first of all, for this feedback. Yes, I think the question which actually comes up in your feedback is that the question is how far or what will the social taxonomy be? Yeah, I think this is really crucial, and we haven't yet given any answer to this. There are different avenues which you could take to make it more broad or less broad. Yeah, especially the vertical dimension has not been really clearly identified, and especially as we have not really fixed which sectors will in it. We have given an idea, but not say finally which ones will be in. And this is, I mean, this is really going to be a difficult and new discussion once this is out. I mean, we have not been supposed to work out a complete social taxonomy with indicators. Even the final report will not give that. It is a slightly moderated version of the draft report. There will be no big surprises there. Some structural changes have been made. Yeah, I think, and I hear some agreement from you that we need both dimensions in a social taxonomy, but these are very different, and they are probably very different to work out once a full social taxonomy is worked out. Yeah, and you always have to remember that taxonomy has always to be linked to an activity. In the final report, we try to link the horizontal dimension, the processes part, more closely to actually activities, because we found it so important that we made an attempt to do this. Because in the end, we think that I mean, we had some discussion about, and I think this is everybody thinks so. If you look at the processes part, so that would mean to adhere to certain core principles and human rights, human guiding principles, the ILO core labor norms, and so on. You've seen the different sub-objectives there. And you could say, well, that is more or less minimum safeguards. That would be one option, yes. But you could also say, and we already say that in the draft report, that actually fulfilling these, depending on the situation, could actually be a substantial social contribution. Let me give you an example. I mean, if you say that the German chemical industry should not employ child labor, of course, you wouldn't say that it would be a substantial contribution if Bayer or BASF does not employ child labor. Of course, they don't. Yeah, that's not a substantial contribution at all. But if you see a certain situation, for example, the chocolate or cocoa farmers in West Africa, you know that there are about 1.5 million children working there in exploitative situations, and 70% of the cocoa worldwide is coming from this area. Companies have been working hard to improve the situation. They were not successful, and these were companies like Mondelez and Cargill and Nestle and so on. And if you compare the situation to the textile industry, you can see that all these food companies have made a much bigger effort to actually abolish child labor in the cocoa industries, and the textile industry has done, for example, on living wages. Yeah, so they were dedicated to change the situation. So if a company comes up and really manages to solve this issue, at least in part, yeah, that would be certainly a substantial contribution for the children and the families involved. So there are situations where we could say that fulfilling the UN guiding principles in certain situations, and that would be, for example, as well, paying a living wage throughout the supply chain of the textile supply chain, yeah, and other situations that would actually mean to make a substantial contribution. If we actually would fulfill the requirement of paying a living wage, which is a human right, that would help a quarter of the world's population, yeah, because there are so many people being paid below a living wage, and it would have so many benefits for whole families, for their healthcare situation, for the education of their children, and so on, that the impact would be huge, yeah, and it would be a huge substantial contribution. It will be difficult to say when and how and if and so on, yes, but it's important to us to say that would be also a way to make a substantial contribution, not only to offer social products and services to a certain group of people.
Great, thank you, Antje. Actually, you already brought up this issue about how broad the taxonomy is and whether it's broad enough or not broad enough. So let me actually pick this topic up and ask Tim about sort of also the geographic orientation of the taxonomy, so to speak. We're talking about the taxonomy being developed in the European Union, so in Europe, but a lot of our discussion is circulating around social issues in developing or emerging markets. So do you think that the current taxonomy is going to be comprehensive enough to tackle these problems that we observe in what's called oftentimes, I think, in terms of region, the global south? Or is it a taxonomy that is very much sort of European driven and European oriented?
Yeah, it's still a little bit of a matter of interpretation how it looks now. Indeed, I think it has, so as Antje suggests, more or less European industries taking into account, of course, with raw materials and also production maybe outsourced to emerging markets. So there's two aspects here. So one is really important to take into account. I think enforcement and use of data is an important one. So what you see is now also a tendency that you, as a Western company, you cannot just stop and say, okay, we pushed liability somewhere else, we did our checks, etc. But there is becoming, I don't know where it's now in the stage of legislation, but becoming legislation that you are responsible for something and liable of what happens in the chain. So that's a very important one. The other way around is, for example, what we do is invest in the emerging markets. So really the activities that are in those countries. I hope that that's also sufficient on the radar of the so to call them writers of the social taxonomy, because that is a slightly different approach. So it's now I see indeed, if you look at the examples, a lot the supply chain from emerging markets to our companies, but it can also be direct investments in emerging markets themselves. Yeah. Yeah. On the well, I already mentioned a bit about why the scope. Yeah, I think the devil's in the detail there on how it will evolve. Well, I think what's also important is really look at how data is being collected, because that's something what we see as an issue in the with the environmental taxonomy as well. It's ESG data providers are popping up everywhere, and that's a business, has become in 2 years a business in itself. But if you talk to data providers, I'm not sure how many people actually, so off-takers of these data, really asking like, where do these data come from? And is this a real reflection of what you're doing? And this is one that counts for CO2 or job creation. Job creation, you can do very easy and say, okay, just country figures, you apply it to a sector. Oh, I'm involved in this sector in this country, so this is the job creation. Or are you actually looking at, well, using primary data and using at the jobs that are created? And then even further, that's even more difficult. Like, okay, what you're doing in terms of human rights, female rights, etc. One question to me is on the scope, because from the name social taxonomy, that doesn't become really clear. But I think it's really important to involve the G of the ESG as well, so the governance. Or we should want to have the ambition to have a governance taxonomy at some point as well. But I think it's what for me, for examples of that would be that a company is also paying their fair taxes. I'm not using fiscal paradises, etc., but also on the board, that they do have a representation of, well, local people, in the end, people that you serve, and also a fair gender representation there. So I think that's also a question a little bit. Like, yeah, I think that's can be more explicit. Maybe we should even call it social SNG taxonomy or something like this. Yeah.
Good point, Tim. Actually, I would like to come back on this issue as well. I saw with great interest when Antje presented that the governance already seems to be part of that taxonomy to some extent. But before we do this, let me give the word to Delphine for a second on what are your views on this issue about comprehensiveness and sort of geographic orientation, as well as the governance issue that Tim just brought up, because I would like to come back to that. Delphine, do you hear me?
Could you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks a lot. Yeah, there are some. So we did this issue of comprehensiveness about sector and also geographical, of course, and sector sector issue from day-to-day business. What we, my first point is that if I take the example of the auto sector, I think it's very interesting to see how the EU is lifting, I would say, or is setting a bar to actually to handle this issue across the supply chain. Sorry, I have some in the background. I hope it's not too. And so what I'm referring to is the directive about the battery, because the EU enacted a battery directive something like I think it's 10 years ago, but it's going and the EU is going to refine this. And the idea here is to ensure that, yes, the EU is going to develop, I would say, a battery expertise, knowledge within its border, but they want, the EU wants company to ensure that there will be three angle to be, I would say, look at by the company is the sourcing, the production, and also the recycling. And the sourcing, it's I think the draft of the EU the battery directive is going to make company responsible for enforcing the OECD principle over the supply chain. And it's all about social issue around, as you were mentioning, artisanal mining on lithium in Congo, and of course child labor. So all this really prominent issue. So so first, for me, it's not contradictory to have a EU, I would say, ambition to lift or I would say, to have some formalization of what is social and what is not social, because it's going to trickle down to across the supply chain and to emerging country. And as we were discussing earlier, I've been contacted and I've been discussing with Securities Commission from Malaysia, and they are taking some inspiration from the social taxonomy draft. Of course, they are not going to take I mean, in a very exhaustive way. It's not going to be a copy paste, but the ambition is there to understand that the practices of the company and to actually to put on the company shoulder the responsibility to I would say enhance the social practices. Then from the day-to-day basis, what we try to do here at BNP Paribas is, of course, we have some kind of absolute social performance. And this is what we call the responsible business conduct. And we apply this to all holdings across our global investment universe. So it means that every company who is in breach with UN Global Compact principle is on a watch list or is excluded from investment. Then on a practical basis, we have some portfolio manager in Brazil, and they are saying to us, yeah, come on, you cannot compare a European company with a Brazilian company. And so, yeah, we take this into account by, I would say, and this is a practical way to deal with this sector and geographical difference, is that we have a relative scoring, which is comparing emerging countries with emerging company with other emerging companies. So this is something that, of course, the EU social taxonomy will not be able to deal with. But the idea is it's our job, our fiduciary responsibility, I would say, to make these social standards applicable when it's possible, and to adapt them to a certain degree to other companies from emerging countries.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Delphine. So, Antje, what are your reflections on this? And also, could you maybe motivate a little bit in more detail how the corporate governance aspect of the social taxonomy was motivated and found its way into the current draft.
Yes. First of all, it was within the scope of our mandate to say something about governance as well. The mandate was very broad. As I've already said, one of the problems we have been struggling with is that a taxonomy has to be activity-based. Yeah? This is with social issues, it's already difficult. I explained how we actually worked around these problems. With governance, it's impossible. And there is one option you can actually have within the taxonomy structure if you find this is not possible to link to activities that are the minimum safeguards. Yeah, the minimum safeguards are linked to the entity. This is actually what Article 18 says in the Delegated Act. I was sorry about giving concrete article numbers. It's just you can't stop it once you're in this. We think that governance actually belongs there. That's why I showed within the second model, you could see that actually the governance was in the minimum safeguard sphere. We have identified, actually governance is a big, huge topic, yes, and the question is what is sustainable governance and what is, well, else governance, yes. So, and here we said, well, look, there are 3 topics where we can say this is really linked to sustainability. Actually, I missed one. Diversity will be on this as well, and this includes whether trade unions are part and the role of trade unions and so on. But yeah, it will be very likely not. There will be no governance taxonomy in the end. It will not be possible because it's not possible to link this to the activity because the whole company, the whole entity actually has a governance for itself, and you have to say whether it fulfills certain governance requirements or not. Yeah.
Very interesting. So actually, there's some questions already coming into the chat, and now there's a few that actually fit into our current debate. So I'll try to actually mix them in already in terms of better time management. So just very quickly, actually, maybe we'll keep the answers relatively to the point. So there's one question for Antje on whether there's going to be some development of a EU social bond standard linked to the social taxonomy, similar to the activities that have been taking place in the environmental/green space. Are you aware of any activities in that respect?
I'm not aware of any activities there, and I suppose there might be some preliminary discussions about this. I mean, of course, the social taxonomy will also apply to social bonds somehow. Yeah, we have to work out a system which can be applied to projects, not only to equity. But how this will actually in the end work out, nobody really knows. Yes, it's part of the package, but yeah, at the moment, I think I have the feeling that there was so much to do with the green taxonomy during the last year, and you've heard all the story about nuclear and gas and all these things. So the Commission was really very much occupied with the environmental part so far, and this is gradually changing at the moment.
Excellent. And the related question on the extent on the principle of proportionality, if it's going to be applied to the data and information requirements, particularly for small organizations. Is there anything that you could briefly comment on?
Yeah, I mean, small companies and organizations are even a bigger problem than with the green taxonomy, because it should be part of a social taxonomy to support small companies and to support investments in small companies. Yes, on the one hand, on the other hand, and there certainly you have seen that microfinance is especially mentioned. On the other hand, there's always this problem: how can small companies actually come up with all these data? Yeah, and will not that be an additional burden? Actually, I have a look at how microfinance institutions are doing this today. Yeah, because then you have an example there how it works. Yes, microfinance institutions today and microfinance funds need some information, social and environmental information from Their clients, they are small and tiny companies. So how do they do this? I think this is a good source to look how this could be done. Yeah, but well, it's a very early stage as well.
Excellent.
In that respect, indeed, you can lean on the experiences of social enterprises, as you may call them, in our part of the world, or indeed microfinance institutions, for example, or other socially driven enterprises that do this already voluntarily in a way, so they are able to do it. But indeed, yeah, have a good look at what are they able to report and which data they can gather, etc.
Yeah.
So actually, that's already the bridge over to the next bigger topic that I wanted to briefly talk about, and that's data. Tim, you mentioned that before. So if you give me like the most important issue that you currently see with the data, and explain a little bit what that issue is and how it can be resolved. Sorry, I was Tim. No, sorry, I was talking to Tim actually. Sorry, I was maybe not clear. Tim, what's your main issue with the data? If you pick one, availability, is it validity? One person in the chat asked actually about the reliability of forward-looking data. What is, if you pick the one issue that you feel like is the most pressing one, which one would it be?
Well, the most difficult one is that people don't try to understand the data anymore at some point, but just follow the numbers. In terms of finance, I think this is what caused the great financial crisis in 2008. But you can have a similar one on environmental data or social data. And this is the distinction between secondary data. Where do they come from? So secondary data, this is data proxies, so not the real data, or primary data from the source itself, and how to go about it. At the same time, realizing that it is very hard to actually gather a number of data. And this is with, if you look at the principled versus impacts of the on the environmental side at the moment, there's a similar discussion that sometimes it's very hard to have this specific data that's being requested, but we do look at it in a broader way. Can we just use that broader way and describe that one? If you look specifically at the social indicators there, than the principled versus impacts, there's the gender equal pay gap ratio, which is an important one. But to bring the entire gender discussion down to this one figure, that's also, well, it doesn't say if someone doesn't have the complete figure there or the data available, that nothing is happening there. So maybe there are policies, maybe something happens. And this is especially important for us. We work in many emerging markets where in some countries the position of women is very challenging, and then every step that you can make is already a really good step in a good direction. In some countries it is the other way around, and there you would expect to have all the data available, etc. So that remains the challenge, how to bring that context around one figure.
I think that's obviously a valid point, but measurement is crucial, right? I mean, in the end, you need to document also your success or your impact, for example, if you want to make these kind of investments. So maybe one number is not the right one, but I guess we might have to get started or maybe live with imperfect measures. Maybe they're better than no measures.
No, you're right there. It helps pushing sectors in the right direction. So it's, so that's, and in the end, it should be a combination of quantitative, qualitative, etc. But no, I agree there. It helps nudging.
Yeah. Nudging is a very good word. We like that in finance. So Delphine, what is your, you also talked about data before. What is the issue that you see most pressing in the data debate?
The first one will be data disclosure. And I agree with what Tim said about the social enterprise. And actually, I think, and about the willingness to report on social data, because this is in the core DNA. So actually, the social enterprise or the small caps, I mean, which are specialized in social business, we get some data from them. And we have a business which is called Solidarity, which is investing in small cap, specialized in tackling social inequalities, and they have many figures. When you are working on the mainstream, I would say on the MSCI World Developed, etc. So MSCI World Developed, it's a benchmark which is around something like less than 2,000 company which are big capitalization. And actually you would be very surprised to see that there are lots of data which are missing. So if I take some example, when you look to the percentage of temporary employees, it's something like 30% of the 30% of the benchmark, which is reporting on that. The number of audits made in the supply chain, it is the percentage of coverage is falling to something like 10%. Well, not even 10%. So this is the challenge, and this is why I'm very positive in the social taxonomy draft, because as I said, it's going to encourage a company to display on that. Then you have this other issue about data. It's you have to find the right balance between outsourcing the data to provider and to still be the master of the interpretation of the data. And that's why I was talking about supplementing the data first. So we have a legacy provider, which is doing his own assessment. And we tend to see that sometimes we are not aligned with the assessment. And so that's why we are looking for raw data, such as percentage of turnover, percentage of temporary worker, because we think that this quantitative data is much more easy to interpret and is much more meaningful than the assessment of the ESG provider. So this is the first challenge. The second challenge is interpretation of the data and the forward-looking. So the forward-looking, we supplement a lot with, I would say, think tank, NGO. And the challenge here is that, of course, we cannot supplement every company of our investment universe of 10,000 companies. So we do a lot with, well, it depends on the coverage of NGO. But this is how we really look at the socials. I mean, we look at different benchmarks from NGO and from think tank on social issues. And so this is where you can, well, you have this, I'm sorry, I'm missing the name of this. It's the Alliance benchmark, the World Alliance benchmark, which is really good in tracking the social issue. For instance, in the new one, which was reported on last year, was on auto, and they do it on the food industry and the textile industry. And so this is very meaningful, and it helps to supplement data. And the other thing is interpretation of the data. And this is where the other challenge for the European social taxonomy is to put some performance standards by sector. Because of course, when I'm looking at the retailing industry, I will have some, some type of contract or some type of structure of contract, which will not be the same as the, I don't know, the auto industry. So, so yeah, I think this is where the challenge is about the sectorization, because every sector has its own, way to work. And for instance, I would say that a 10% percentage of temporary worker would be a bad performance in, I don't know, in auto industry, and would be a good performance, I'm saying good performance, in retailing industry. So this is a challenge.
Excellent, thank you very much. Very interesting thoughts. So actually now let's come back to a couple of questions from the audience. I have one to read from the chat, and then I will hand over the word also to Jürgen Hammer from SPTF for a question. So the one question from the chat, I think also goes mostly to Antje. And the question is about the just transition concept that was identified in the case of the green taxonomy? Is something similar planned or in the planning, so to speak, for the social taxonomy as well?
Yeah, the just transition is an important issue for social taxonomy. We still have to see how we get it in. Yeah, it has certainly to do with training and with not shedding jobs. Yes, and to investing in certain areas and regions which are especially hard hit by the transition, by the green energy transition. So yes, it is a topic which will be taken up, and you also find it, and it's a very important topic. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Jürgen, why don't you want to ask your question directly?
No, I think it was a question, a bit of a comment to some of the challenges raised, whether it's about the global south or whether it's about the smaller companies. What we have learned in the inclusive finance sector is that it is, of course, important, very important, that we define the concepts, the taxonomies, which we try to do as a sector. But in what is also very important in a topic as, I would say, as new as it is, social performance management, is to have a very important element of learning and improvement for the sector globally to advance. Because what we absolutely want to avoid in a future taxonomy is that it becomes too, let's say, too demanding, and it ends up being a checkbox for the biggest companies that have a capacity to fulfill a list of requirements, check the boxes, and nothing changes. And we had those examples in the industry. So what was really important was to say, this is a new field, and I think we will learn a lot over the next years and fine tune many of the concepts. We won't get it right at the first level, but let's define fundamental concepts together and make sure that we offer also, as an industry, and I think, Tim, you mentioned it, data generation. We have an explosion of companies now that offer data. Let's not run towards the quickest data solution. Let's define fundamental concepts and learn together. Again, I often like to use the microfinance sector as a laboratory, small laboratory for learning what are responsible financial services. And I think we can learn a lot from that. And as we did, and I sent you the link in the webpage if you want to have a look at that, a very important element of what we did over the last 15 years was define, assess, and plan, improve. And that helped the sector to engage everyone on that path towards better practices of socially responsible financial services or socially responsible economies.
Yeah, I very much agree to this, actually. Actually, if you have a look at the UN guiding principles and how they should be implemented, what they basically say is that companies should actually talk to the right people in the right way, listen to them, improve, and never stop doing so. Yeah, but this is so far away from calculating CO2 emissions. But that's actually what companies need to do. Yeah, but how can you put that into reporting requirements, and into data? This is really difficult without losing the concept, that this is about people and about that you have to talk about with people and that you have to learn from them and improve from and act on what they want you to do. Yeah, it's really difficult. Yeah, but we try. And I say that is very important, that this concept, of talking to people and learning from people, learning from those who are affected from human rights abuses, from a lack of basic products and so on, is crucial.
Great, thank you very much. I want to basically run one more round before the final round, and I would like to actually focus on the two fund managers on the panel and about an issue about what is your perception, given that you know the industry very well, about this issue of social greenwashing. I think we need to come up with a better term that does not mix up environmental and social aspects, but you know what I mean. So do you think that this is this something that you encounter in your day-to-day life, that this is something to be careful about, and to, you know, competitors are sort of using these kind of techniques, or is it something that is only, you know, developing slowly? Delphine, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that we have as an asset manager, we have a responsibility to be very, very rigorous in our assessment. I'm thinking about one of the trend which is developing on the social bond market. And we sometimes it's difficult, and that's why the social taxonomy is going to help us, because I'm just thinking about one of the conflict that we can have is to say is to think about what is the impact, what is the real impact, and for I would say for a big cap, sometimes it's really difficult to be able to make a formalization of the impact, and because like I don't know, let's take one giant French giant on agro on food. Okay. They maybe contribute to SDG. Well, I think this is SDG 3 or the second one or the third one. I should know this by heart, but the one which is helping to to reduce or to suppress hunger. I mean, yes, if you are selling some products which are accessible to low-income people in Africa, do you qualify this as an impact, or is it just that you are developing a product that is going to open to you new market? Mm-hmm, and this is our day-to-day, I would say, not tragedy, but this is the day-to-day problematic struggle. Yeah, because we have to really be able to to distinguish what is the business as usual and from the impact that you can formalize. So this is where, of course, there is some social bond principle, but I think that they are going to be supplemented and really well supplemented by the EU social taxonomy, because it's going to help us to have to have an harmonized, I would say, reference and framework. But I'm saying that now, from an asset manager to another, it's really interpretation, and so yeah, of course you can have some social washing, but I don't think this is right now I would say a feature which is well developed. I don't think so, but we of course we are very careful about that.
Okay, thank you. We're running a little bit out of time, so I would like to have one last round with everyone, and short answers, please. And I think the last question I would have is, as we all know, Christmas is coming up very soon. So if you have one wish about either the social taxonomy or the social dimension of sustainability in general, like, you know, progress or advancements in that area, what would it be? We'll start with Tim.
Well, my wish would be that it wouldn't be necessary, because every company would already be socially driven. But it's maybe really a wish. That's maybe not a concrete
That's
idea.
an ambitious wish, but you never know. Great, thank you. Delphine?
I wish that we could, as an industry, think about long-term decision, because for me the social dimension is really the backbone of financial performance. If you give the chance to the social dimension to be developed, and of course you have to give I would say a time frame which is I would say higher than 6 months, 1 month. You have really to take into perspective long-term decision, and I think it's going to benefit to all. So, well, my wishes is long term.
Great. Thank you. Antje.
I would wish, of course, for a good and effectful social taxonomy coming up. Yeah.
Great. That was very efficient. So thank you very much to all of you. I think we just made it on time. I think it was a very, to me personally, I think it was a very interesting discussion. Thanks to our three speakers and panelists for sharing your insightful experiences and knowledge in this area with us. I enjoyed it very much. This is the end of the event. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the day and the afternoon, and of course the period until Christmas. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Yes, thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Everyone, thanks.